Okay, so what we've got to talk about next is what we're going to be doing now that we've learned how to write, identify what the claim is, identify the claim as either the null or the alternative hypothesis. That's just step number one. Now that we've done that, we are going to do a test. And the test is going to determine whether or not we accept or reject the claim, okay? And I'm using those words loosely right now because of the fact that there's a particular way that we have to state our conclusion, but that's something yet to come. Okay, so this right here is basically going to be what we're doing. Um, what the Remember, there's only three possible cases for the null and the alternative hypothesis. We're going to be involving the greater than and less than, and then we're going to be involving the equal and not equal. That's the only three possible cases. So, what we're going to do is we're going to determine based on which one of these we have written, and I'll explain it to you in just a second. Based on which one of these we have written, we're going to take our normal curve and we're going to shade a section of it. Okay. And we're going to determine which section that we shade based on what we have written. Okay. So that's why being able to write this is so important, because this is going to tell us what our picture looks like. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, based on this claim right here, we're going to figure out whether or not a z value that we find is either going to be in the shaded section or it's not going to be in the shaded section. Okay, we're going to find a z value based on the information that we have right here. And whether or not that z value is in the shaded section or not in the shaded section will determine what we think about the claim. That will help us determine the outcome of our claim. Do we believe the claim or not? Okay, that's a simplistic way of putting it, but that's basically what's happening. Now, remember, shaded sections underneath the curve are just an area, okay? So we're going to be looking at the placement of the z-score, and we're also going to be looking at the area and comparing it to a set standard. So again, this is all that's coming. We'll get to this in just a second. I just want to explain to you first of all what this is, and then I think I'm going to have us go back and determine what kind of test. So these are the three kind of tests that we have. We're either going to have a left tail test, a right tail test, or a two tail test. And those tests are going to be determined based on the alternative hypothesis. So be sure you're hearing my words. I want to write this down to make sure you hear me. The alternative, let me do it like this. H sub A is what determines the kind of test. Okay, the alternative hypothesis is what determines the kind of test. So we have a left tail test. It says it right over here, but this you look at your alternative hypothesis, and when your alternative hypothesis is less than, and I'll put the words right there, less than, you use a left tail test. Okay, if your alternative hypothesis contains less than, then you use a left tail test. And that's going to be the opposite. If your alternative hypothesis is greater than, you're going to use the right tail test. And if your alternative hypothesis is not equal to, then you're going to use the two tail test. You'll have shading on both sides. All right. So let's run back up here and identify which kind of tests these are. Okay. Let me change my color of writing. All right. So we look at the alternative. We look at this one for the type of test. It's the not equal to, so it's the two-tail test. Okay. Let's go down to the next one. We look at the alternative. We look at this one. You always look at H sub A. And notice that right here, the alternative hypothesis happens to be the claim. But down here, the alternative hypothesis is not the claim. That doesn't matter anything right now, but eventually it will matter. Because sometimes the alternative hypothesis is the claim, sometimes the alternative hypothesis is not the claim. And that is going to be confusing when we start explaining the results of the test. Okay. So back to determining what kind of test. You look at the alternative hypothesis to see what kind of test we have. This is greater than, so it's a right tail test. We look at the alternative hypothesis. And again, this time the alternative hypothesis happens to be the claim. Doesn't mean anything to us right now, doesn't help us determine what kind of test it is. It's just, it will matter when we start concluding or coming up with a conclusion for our test. All right, so alternative hypothesis is greater than. So again, this is a right tail test. And this is the alternative hypothesis. All right. And this time the alternative hypothesis is less than. So it is a left tail test. And then these two, here's the alternative hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis right here, it's less than, so it's a left tail. And here is the alternative hypothesis. It is not equal to, so it's a two-tail test. Okay. So labeling all of this is going to be what you have to do on your take-home test. It is going to require, there's a few questions. Since you're going to do the entire thing take home, there's a few questions where all you do is answer this part. But most of the questions will be a complete test where you write. You start off by identifying the claim. You write the null. You identify which is the null. You identify what's the alternative. You identify what test. You write all that down. Then you draw the picture. You find your z-score or your t-score depending on what kind of test you're doing, and then you come up with the conclusion, and then you write your statement. So that's kind of all the parts. But again, we'll get to that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop. You can go ahead and look at these right here. What do the directions say for each claim? You're going to do the same thing. Find the, identify the claim, and then label the null and the alternative hypothesis. Be sure you're using symbols. Then tell me if it's a right tail, left tail, or two tails test. Go ahead and sketch a normal sampling distribution, and we'll do the shading part together. Okay, I'm going to stop this, but you see if you can't do problems 1, 2, and 3, everything except for the shading part. Okay.